Isn't that neat? And then they turn the sound on at the exact same time. It's almost like we know what we're doing. Whew. It's really not anything I do. It's Ken and Bobby and the crew up there, Daniel. All right, so obviously I'm sitting in one chair by myself, and before anybody asks, Dr. Cloud's fine. Juanita's not feeling well, and they were really trying to be here this morning. We spoke a couple of times over the weekend, yesterday at length on the phone and in emails, and I told him, I said, just take care of Juanita. I mean, don't make a 80-mile round trip from Franklin and be worried about her the whole time. So they're online, and we hope that they'll be back next week, but she wasn't feeling well, and he wasn't going to come without her. So I think that's the right decision. So we will soldier on together here for our study of Ruth, and I think you'll enjoy this morning. We get to look at some things that the sermon really didn't have time to cover, and yet the sermon hinted at some of them. So I think what will be fascinating this morning is we'll have a little bit more depth to what we just listened to, or you just heard if you're online with us and you listened to the sermon there. If you look at how chapter 2, which Les pointed out that we're in chapter 2 of Ruth, and we are too, or as well, here in class, you might notice that the biggest emphasis at the beginning is Naomi telling Ruth what she suggests that she does. And there's an interesting word here on the screen. One might want to listen to advice. And this little graphic that I found is, hear all advice, listen to good advice, and heed wise counsel. And I don't know about you guys, but I can deal with hear all advice, and I can say, okay, I'll give anybody the opportunity to tell me something that might educate me on something or might, tip me to something I wouldn't have known, right? Listen to good advice. That's an interesting phrase. Hear all advice, but listen to good advice. So there's a difference between hearing and listening, which I think we all know, right? I can hear what Cheryl says to me, but if I don't listen to what Cheryl tells me, then later I might not be able to recall anything because I really wasn't listening, right? But heed is not a word that we use that much. Heed wise counsel. What do you do with heed? How do you heed their advice? What does that even mean? I mean, it's all over the place. If you go out there and look for it on the internet, you can find all numerous things that say, heed the advice of, heed wise counsel. Well, if you look at the etymology of the word, it basically means like this little guy over here on the corner, this little androgynous dude with the sign, listen to me. Like, it's almost like a wake-up call. I'm not just saying that you should courteously be kind to me and listen to what I have to say and then dismiss it or be thinking about what you want to say next or be thinking about what you're going to have for lunch and you're not really even listening to anything I'm saying. And it's even bigger than that. It's not really just listening so that if I ask you a quiz question, you can repeat to me what I said. That'll prove that you heard what I said, but did you take it to heart? Heed actually means taking it to heart. Look at some of the older definitions there. Careful attention, notice, regard. Says it only survives in literary use, and it's the object of verbs like take heed or heed. Old English, observe, to take care of, attend, care for, protect, take charge of. And then there's some other stuff there that I won't bore you with because probably get into difficulty of pronouncing it anyway from Old Saxon. But my point is, it's a word that we just kind of let come in one ear and out the other, and we don't really think about what it means. But I think what Naomi is saying to Ruth in the first verses of chapter 2 is heed my advice. There's this guy that is from our clan, from Amalek, named Boaz. She's already telling her about him before she ever even goes anywhere, right? And so if we're not careful, we don't see in the text that this advice comes to her first, and then she asks if she can go glean in the field and gets permission to go. So just an interesting order of events. So who was Boaz? Well, now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side of the family named Boaz, and he was a wealthy, prominent man from the clan of, and I found this interesting. If you want to, it's weird sometimes the way we pronounce in English. We say Amalek, but that's kind of hard to do if you look at the word. The L comes before the M, right? So really, if you look at this word in Hebrew, it's really Eli from the story of Eli that we know well over Samuel, right? Eli and Samuel. It's really Eli and Melech, which means king. So really, if you want to slow it down and pronounce it in 2 syllables, you could pronounce it Eli Melech, which would be my God is king, is what the name means, and that would actually be, in my mind, more of the correct pronunciation of the word. But he's the son of Salmon, which we heard this morning, who is the son of Rahab. So we've got a lineage developing here to Jesus, that when we get to the New Testament and we look at the genealogies, a lot of this makes more sense because of where we live versus what was going on at the time. They wouldn't have seen the importance of a Canaanite and a Moabite at the time, right? It would have just seemed odd, but they wouldn't have been able to put the pieces together on why it's important like we can. So the husband of Ruth, father of Obed, and great-grandfather of King David, Boaz is famous for his role as the kinsman redeemer in Ruth, and that's probably the title that we know of best. But what we're going to look at this morning are some other titles that are in the text. And before we get to those, here's another family tree, and this was the one I was really referencing last week when we were looking at how deeply it went all the way back up to Tamar and Judah. You notice that Chilion and Mahlon there are grayed out because they're no longer alive. And this is sad in a way, but this is reality, I guess. Some of us in this room or connected to this room understand how this works. You're still family through people that you're only family with the people who are alive through the people who are dead. Does that make sense? And that's what's happening here. So Naomi starts calling Ruth her daughter, but Ruth is not her daughter. Ruth is her daughter-in-law because her son that Ruth was married to passed away. And that's just something else we have to remember or keep in our mind as we go through the story. Is their family, but their family through marriages that are now no longer because the husbands are deceased. And in the narrative that follows, Boaz is confirmed as a rich man, a landowner with servants, but he's also a righteous and moral man who's able to bring Yahweh's blessings to his people and to Ruth. Right there, there's a lot buried in that statement. When it says at the beginning that he's confirmed as a rich man and a landowner with servants, we could stop right there and say, okay, wait a second, this is something bigger than just a really nice man or just our favorite uncle or just the rich guy that's in our family that has a bunch of property or whatever. I mean, you have to stop and say it's more than that. This is not just about material possessions. This is a person that has a certain level of status or a certain level of recognition from society, not just the family. He is known, as we see in the story and was pointed out in the sermon today, even coming into the scene, he's bringing a blessing from Yahweh to everyone who's in the field. Now, not all those people in the field are related to him. Some of them are just his workers. And he has a level of workers underneath him. Does that all make sense and clear? And so in that reenactment story that I've referred to a couple of weeks now, when we found some of these pictures, here's what they made a character look like maybe for Boaz. You know, a distinguished person who just kind of exudes respect when he walks onto the scene, and everybody recognizes him even if they don't know who he is. Like, it would be like if someone walked in this room right now and all of us just kind of went, I don't know who this is, but this person clearly is somebody that we ought to know who it is, or we ought to treat with some level of respect other than just some average person. Now that sounds odd a little bit coming from church perspective that we're all equal, because we are, but we know that in the broken world that's not always the case, and that there are some people who are, for various reasons, elevated over other people. And Boaz is just one of those people that was humble about it and gracious about it, and yet it was still recognizable. So people would not fail to see that he was this person of great wealth or great importance. And another source actually just calls him the sheik of the village. And you've probably heard that word from me and Dr. Cloud a couple of times in this class, because we use sheik or we use prince, even though prince is a different Hebrew word. But this idea of the chosen one out of the family like when we were back studying Joseph, Joseph was the one who received the coat of many colors because he was that important to Jacob. He was the chosen sheik or the representative of the family. All right? Boaz has been chosen by somebody, probably his parents, who are probably no longer since he's older, and he has been chosen in that same vein or that same way like Joseph was. He's the one who is the legacy of the family, if you want to use that term. And so in verses 2 through 3, they contain a short scene where the roles reverse between Naomi and Ruth for the first time. Ruth is portrayed as the primary actor for the first time, and Naomi's role is that of a reactor. The scene consists of two phrases, the first transpiring in the house where Naomi and Ruth are staying, and the second on the way to the field. As in previous episodes, dialogue takes up almost the entirety of the former phase. So what the person is trying to convey there, what we're trying to say, is that Naomi has been the locus of the conversation. She's been the core of every advice going to Ruth. Now Ruth is taking action because she realizes the position that she's in, and she needs to somehow kind of get up enough courage to go out and do something about it. And so the roles actually in the narrative reverse to where Ruth becomes the primary actor or the primary character, which makes sense because what's the name of the book? Ruth, not Naomi, right? So we started with Naomi. We've switched over to Ruth. But this time, Ruth seizes the initiative. The narrator's identification of her, again, as the Moabitess reflects the extraordinary nature of her actions. She's an alien in a foreign land and determined to make something of her life. She's listened to Naomi, she's heeded her advice, and she's going to go out and actually put it to action. And she's going to try to do something that, if we remember from chapter 1 and everything we've talked about in this class so far, she's going to try to not end up with the bleak outlook that Naomi describes, being a widow in a foreign land without a husband, with no place in society to really have anybody take care of her, right? That's what that last phrase of making something out of her life, that's what she intends to do by doing these actions. And this was covered well in the sermon, this idea that the Mosaic law left areas of the field for gleaning. It just sets up the fact that this is why this option is there. But where I want us to peel off from the sermon a little bit and go in a different direction, a little bit deeper direction, is that's not saying that Ruth is poor. If you interpret Leviticus and Deuteronomy's instructions for not picking up what you drop and not gleaning the field completely for the poor, then one might be tempted to say, well, Ruth must have been poor, and that's why she was able to do that. But the story's not saying that Ruth is poor. The story's just saying that Ruth, as a foreigner, is going out there and taking the position in the field of one of the gleaners. So hopefully you see that. And then what transpires when she's doing that is where it really gets interesting. As a Moabite and a widow, Ruth qualifies to glean on two counts, that she's a foreigner and that she's a widow. Not that she's destitute or is starving or necessarily poor, but in a way, now that I'm talking through this out loud, she's closer to the poor category than the Boaz category. Does that make sense? Because she's, unfortunately, at the time of human history, a female, unmarried, she does qualify for the gleaning action and for the law to apply to her. But for these same two reasons, she could not count on the goodwill of the locals, hence her concern about gleaning behind someone who would look upon her with favor. And that's where we're going to go next, to that word, favor, after we look at this. This is a relief that is showing ears of grain, just interesting ripe barley. And this is from Tel Amarna, that we were talking about Amarna and the Amarna letters a couple weeks ago. And so I thought that was interesting, that there's an archaeological find that just kind of puts a picture, if you will, in that time of the world to a story that we know, that we believe, that we know is true. But here is, photographic evidence, because they didn't have the ability to do photographs, that just shows that time of year with the barley harvest. And here's what it might have looked like as she goes out to the field. And as Les said, the women would be going ahead of her. The men would have cut the barley. They would be putting it into the sheaves or putting it into bales or the groupings that they're doing. And there's women out there uh, taking part in that activity from verse 3. But the expression find favor in the eyes of is at home in the court. If you were to have a judicial situation where you're in the court and you've got the jury and you've got the judge, that's really where that phrase comes from, is to find favor in the eyes of the judge, where a subject would acknowledge his or her dependence upon the need for mercy at the hands of the king or the hands of the judge. This expression appears in Ruth in chapter 2, verse 2 and 10 and 13, and it is most often used with a subordinate of servant requests permission for something from a superior. That's important. This is where I think we can really add some more color to chapter 2 and what's going on. There's nothing we heard this morning that's not accurate and correct about her being a foreigner. And maybe people in that field saying, we don't want a Moabite woman here working with us, or we don't want Boaz to say, give this person special attention and drop some things on purpose. All that is correct. And there's something else going on, because this favor in the eyes of someone has to be brought into it as well. It's not just ethnicity and the fact that she's different from the other people. She's different in another way as well. But see, Ruth, I have a question mark up there, subordinate with a question mark. Ruth will play the role of the subordinate servant. If you think about that statement, you might say, well, how? Well, look at what she's taking the position of. She's going out to the field to do the gleaning that we've already seen is how she's qualified for it. She's behind the other women that are out there, and we haven't yet identified who Ruth really is. Like, let's do this. Let's say that, trying to think of a good example. Let's say that someone we all recognize has earned their way to some level of status or recognition. Like maybe the mayor. Let's just say that. Okay, the mayor comes in here, and when the mayor comes in, would we expect the mayor, if we were handing out odd jobs to do in this room this morning, let's say that like tonight after the Chosen, there'll be popcorn on the floor and stuff, and somebody's got to vacuum, and somebody's got to use the dustpan, and somebody's got to take the trash out. If the mayor showed up, would we likely assign the mayor vacuuming or dustpan for cleaning up the room? Probably not, right? But if the mayor came in here and purposely chose to do the least job and get in the least position, we'd scratch our heads and say, what's going on here? You know, here's somebody who has earned the right to be at this other level, showing up with us and choosing to do the most meaningless task in our minds and the grunt work, right? And we just kind of scratch our head and say there must be something going on. That, I think, is what we have to add to this passage, this text in chapter 2, because that's what Ruth is doing. Now, they may not see it, but hang on and we'll see it. So she asked to do this, seeking permission from the landowner, who then could show benevolence by granting her request to glean in his field behind the harvest workers. More on this question in just a few minutes. Is she a subordinate or not? This is from verse 3. She happened to come to the part of the field that belonged to Boaz. Newly planted wheat field. Might have looked something like that. Very Ireland looking to me, but nice and green and ready to be harvested. So here's the next little injection, and Les hinted at this. He had a place where he chuckled in the sermon and said something about she just happened to show up, Boaz just happened to come into the field at the same time, and he said, you know, what's the probability of that? That's what Dr. Cloud and I were building on here. We might have a phrase there at the bottom of the screen, as you can see, as luck would have it, except Israelites didn't believe in luck. That would not be a phrase they would use. Verse 3b, the second half of verse 3 says, and her chance chanced upon the allotted portion of the field of Boaz. Now yours probably doesn't say that, but that's what the Hebrew actually says. And her chance chanced, which is sort of like saying it was just on a wing and a prayer. You know, it was just like unbelievable. It was a once in a lifetime type opportunity. All those different phrases that we're probably accustomed to hearing people say sometimes. And in this context, the narrator draws attention to Ruth's chance arrival at the field of Boaz with the redundant phrase, her chance chanced upon, which in modern idiom would be rendered as by a stroke of luck, or as luck would have it. But as the next screen is going to tell us, to the Orthodox Israelite, to the straight and narrow Israelite who is following Yahweh, who believes that God is in control of everything and with them at all times, there was no such thing as chance or luck. They just would never say that. And you might say, well, wait a minute, what about casting of lots? Isn't that chance or luck? Well, if you think about casting of lots in the Bible, the way we might have a die or dice if we're playing a board game, then I could see how you could go there, right? You'd say, well, they're doing this, whoever chose the shortest straw ends up having something to do. Who would know what the probability of choosing the shortest straw is, any more so than rolling a dice and wondering what number is going to come up? The difference, though, is Scripture tells us that even the casting of lots is governed and controlled by Yahweh. So even the practice that foreign nations would have seen as luck, Israelites would not have seen as luck. Does that make sense? In other words, I could get up here with two dice and I could say that Yahweh is in control of what's in my hand, and I could roll them, and whatever the answer is would not be probability from math or chance. It would be because Yahweh made those dice land on those numbers. That's how an Israelite would see that. If the Lord even determines how the dice fall, then how can the narrator speak so explicitly of chance? Well, Dr. Cloud and I believe it's a play on words. It's not chance. That's the whole point. That's what the narrator is trying to get us to see. It is a deliberate rhetorical device on the part of the narrator. By excessively attributing Ruth's good fortune to chance, they force the reader to sit up and take notice and to ask questions concerning the significance of everything that is transpiring, the whole scene. What's going on? How come he recognizes her so fast, that we're going to look at here in a second? How come she is willing to take that remedial position in the field and go behind the women that are gleaning? The statement is ironical. Its purpose is to undermine purely rational explanations for human experiences and to refine the reader's understanding of providence. In other words, that God is making all this happen. It's all orchestrated. And I found this. I don't know much from Warfield right off the top of my head, but I thought this was a good quote. A firm faith in the universal providence of God is the solution of all earthly troubles. Don't you just wish we could actually say that to ourselves more than we do? That whatever's happening to me that's an earthly trouble is probably for my shaping, probably for my better outcome, for my Christian formation, and not just woe is me or just bad luck. It could be that every single thing, as he's suggesting through faith, is universally providential from God, and it's really the answer to all earthly troubles, whether we can see it at that time or not. I mean, think about this story. Ruth may have had the courage and the statement we looked at that she's going to go out and she's going to make something happen, but she knows she's not going to make anything happen without Yahweh, and she doesn't even yet know what Yahweh is going to make happen. Does that make sense? She faithfully believes he'll make something happen, but she hasn't been able to write down on paper what the outcome's going to be. So the narrator is screaming, see the hand of God at work here. The same hand that had sent, look at what we've been through in the story so far. The same hand that sent the famine in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, which sent her family to Moab, right? We went through that 2 weeks ago. And later provided food in verse 6, where there was the barley harvest, is the same hand that brought Naomi and Ruth to Bethlehem precisely at the beginning of that harvest in verse 22, and now has guided Ruth to that portion of the field belonging specifically to Boaz. That's how to actually start seeing the scene, is that God is orchestrating all this, and that none of this just happened by chance or by weird, fateful timing. And the narrator is playing off of that in what's written. Now, this was supposed to be Dr. Cloud's slide because the Hebrew word hane is lo and behold, and he says lo and behold all the time, and I'll whisper sometimes hane every time he does it. because he could teach you guys a Hebrew word that you would never forget because he uses lo and behold so much. But lo and behold is how verse 4 starts. It starts in A, like look, like wow, or hey, take notice of this. It not only shifts the reader's attention from Ruth to Boaz, who has arrived at the field where Ruth is, but also expresses wonder at his arrival and timing. So it's kind of like, wow, you're here, and look, Boaz is here. You know, it's an emphatic emotional reaction to this would not happen. What would be the probability that if we went to visit, whatever, I'm struggling this morning for my examples. Let's go to England. Let's go to the palace, right? What would be if the Queen was still with us? What would have been the odds of you going to tour the Queen's residence on your vacation and her being there and talking to you? You know, that's kind of what the Hene is saying. This is just unbelievable. You wanted to go find Boaz's field, you found it, and look, he showed up. So that's all God's providence doing that. Ruth got there at just the right time to meet Boaz. It seems not to have taken Boaz long to notice the stranger in the field. Okay, here we go. Here's what we're suggesting. In addition to the fact that she's a foreigner, there's something else that's going on. Don't really know, can't dogmatically say that she had her hair a certain way or that she was wearing certain clothing or that she had certain jewelry on. Don't know what the indicator would be, but there's got to be something more than just ethnicity, I think. Because what we don't have from the text is how far off was Boaz's gaze, right? If someone's back there where Rod's sitting in the back of the auditorium and I kind of go, that person I don't recognize, I probably can't tell from here that I don't recognize them because they're wearing something that we don't typically wear in here or they're from a different part of the country. I wouldn't be able to tell that. There's got to be something else that is standing out besides just that she's a foreigner. At least most scholars and several theologians believe, and I lean that way. I'm saying that I think we can explore this a little bit. Let's say that there's the Moabite part, there's the part that she's a foreigner, and then let's say what else is going on. Well, if he notices that this woman should not be doing the job she's doing, there must be an indication of why that would be, right? And the text actually tells us this. So if we keep looking at what it says here, it doesn't take him long to notice that there's a stranger in his field, for he turns to his servant in charge of the harvesters. Now, here's the first occurrence of the word. This is not a word. This is not a word for. I don't like the NIV's translation of overseer. I know why they use that word, but this is not an elder. This is not a person of governance. This is a na'ar. This is a person who has status that when the boss man's away, they leave it with this person. Does that make sense? Anybody Star Trek fans? Jim's not in here today, but if you're a Star Trek fan, every single time the captain leaves the bridge to somebody, they leave the bridge to the first officer, right? The na'ar is kind of like the first officer. He's not necessarily got the ability all the time to tell people what to do, but he is the person that the captain, or that in this case the sheik or Boaz, just say his name, goes to for his information. While I was away, what went on? Give me a digest of what we did. So he's kind of like second in command. And that's who Boaz turns to and asks, what about this person that's in the field? And the narrator's use of na'ar there, rather than eved, is really interesting, because if they had wanted to just say servant, if they'd wanted to just say this is one of the workers that reports to Boaz, they would have used eved, not na'ar. So na'ar is above a regular worker. Okay, everybody can see your excitement on how excited you are about that definition. But it's really important because we're going to look at Boaz here in a second as well. So this was intentional to reflect the ranking. It's what most scholars, biblical scholars, believe is going on. And qualified even with the extra phrase of who was stationed over the harvesters. That gives you a nod to this is not just one of the workers. This isn't just worker number 57. This is the guy who, if something were to happen to Boaz, everybody would turn to look at this guy and say, what do we do now? He's the foreman. He's the supervisor. At first glance, Boaz's question to this foreman seems odd. Instead of the expected, who is this young woman, he asks, to who does this young woman belong? All right, most of us, me included, would probably have thought or have thought he's asking who she's married to. Maybe, but maybe not. I have there a question mark. Marriage? Maybe, but something else is present in the text that we don't see in English. We just read that, who does this woman belong? And we think, well, I guess that's how they referred to who was married to who, is that she belongs to somebody. Remember Les talking about the clan? She can belong to something other than just a mate. She can belong to a family or a clan, and that's what we think Boaz is recognizing, in addition to the fact that she's a foreigner, because the text uses the female version of Na'ar for Ruth and says Na'arah, which means she is the equivalency of a princess. And if she's the princess, that means over in Moab world, where she's come from, she is one of the people who are at the upper level of society that would be recognized as somebody who doesn't do these types of jobs. Does that make sense? So princess is probably the best word to use in English, even though it's a little off from the Hebrew, I think. But we don't have a better English word to really put in this morning to get you a mental picture of what's going on. So if she's a princess, and Boaz's recognition of Ruth as a woman of status, then a Na'arah suggests that she is considerably out of place in the field. It also raises expectations in the reader's mind. In other words, he's looking over there going like, okay, one of these things is not like the other. That person it's shocking to me. It's surprising that she's out there doing that, because she is a princess from where she comes from, and she has put herself in a position that's lower than what she would normally do. So there's humility there. There's also intentionality. So that would be why the shock. The foreman's answer to Boaz's question repeats information the narrator had offered before, right? We knew that all the way back in Ruth chapter 1, verse 22. She's a Moabite woman, the one who returned or came back from the land of Moab with Naomi. His addition of Na'arah, though, again raises the reader's hopes. A princess, a Moabitess, she is what he's actually saying. So that changes it a little bit. She's unmarried, we know that because her husband passed away, but she's also a princess. And so back to our reenactment, here's what the Na'arah sitting in the unexpected role might have looked like, where she's in the grain and working. And again, we think that he would have noticed this right off. And see, that makes sense of this statement in verse 7. Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she's almost having to ask for permission to go take this lesser role. Yeah. Joe's saying it's all the dirt that rocky. Yeah. A lot of it is. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of it is. So she said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, since I'm a foreigner? Okay, so there's where probably a lot of people say, well, let's just stick with the foreigner thing. And that's fine. If you want to stick with only the foreigner concept, nothing wrong with it. She is a foreigner. He would have recognized she's a foreigner. But she's a foreigner who's also a princess. And so there's just another half there. Ruth and Boaz conversing in the reenactment story, where he's come up to her and he's saying these things to her that we went through in the text this morning. And then the taking refuge statement, you might have recognized that. It's in the Psalms. It's Jesus talking about gathering Jerusalem like chicks under a mother hen. And yet, there's another translation of that word besides wings. There's actually, as odd as this is going to sound, the Hebrew can also be translated as skirt, which sounds strange. Why would you want to gather people under your skirt? But the point is, it's protection. It's a family house. Remember that in this time, women and families were part of the house of, and then the man's name would be used, who's the patriarch of the family. And so this idea of extending wings or skirt or rooftop even is out over people that would then be brought underneath the protection of that family unit. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so we went through the ephah of barley, roughly 30 pounds. Some people think that's way too heavy. Other people think it's spot on. I'm not getting into it. I don't know. But you can always find somebody with a different opinion if you look long enough. But here is a tablet recording barley rations distributed to individuals from Babylon, which is interesting. So we do have this idea that an ephah, if we don't know exactly what it weighs in our units of measure, that's one thing. But we do know that that is, in fact, an outside the Bible unit of barley, which is also just nice to find to corroborate what the text is saying. And he said to me, "You shall stay close to me, to my Na'arim, actually, to his Na'aras that are there working, until they finish all the harvest." So we've got a whole group of people here that are people of status, people of notoriety, some sort of level. So what else is interesting is that Boaz is referred to as a Gibor, which is a different Hebrew word. It's Dr. Cloud and I spoke at length on it on Saturday. It's sometimes used like for David's mighty men. The mighty part is the Gibor. It's sometimes used for a warrior, someone who's gone off to battle. But here for Boaz, it's used as sort of like the ultimate level of person that all the other people in this story are umbrellaed underneath. So he's the top of the pyramid, basically, of the people organizational chart, if that makes sense. From the first time Boaz opens his mouth until the last words he utters, which we'll look at in chapter 4, his tone exudes compassion, grace, and generosity. In the man who speaks to this Moabite field worker, biblical hesed becomes flesh and dwells among humankind. What that statement is saying, if you remember hesed, this loving kindness, mercy, loyal love, commitment, covenantal love. Basically, Boaz is exuding this level of commitment to Ruth that we've only seen in this story so far from Ruth to Naomi. So we're seeing a circle of hesed. We're seeing it come from Boaz to Ruth, where Ruth was staying with Naomi when Naomi was trying to send her back to her people that we talked about last week. Ruth sets aside her Na'arah status and works in the field at a level below her rank so that the submission can elevate her even more. Ruth returns hesed to Boaz like she did to Naomi. And that first sentence there in that second paragraph is really powerful, I think. She sets aside her status and works in the field at a lower level, which is what Jesus does when he washes the apostles' feet, right? This is not new. This is just, we didn't realize it was this far back in the Bible, that it was all the way back in the Old Testament, that people who follow Yahweh were doing this type of activity, where they're putting themselves last and putting everybody else first, even if they have the right to not have to put themselves last, which obviously Jesus is the ultimate example of that. He didn't have to wash other people's feet, but yet he did, and he said he came to be a servant of all. And that's what we think Ruth is also doing. She's laying down that she could have marched in there and said, well, in my country, I'm at the same level you guys are in my country. I wouldn't have to do this. It's not what she does. She decides to let that go, and it actually ends up blessing her. So God moves and guides us just as Yahweh guided and directed Ruth in her choices. Discernment, which may seem to be a circumstance of chance, is a decision made by Almighty God's providential hand. I don't know if you can see that in your life all the time. I haven't always seen it. Somebody, and I probably should have put it in here, but with both of us up here, we probably would have not gotten here this fast. There's a quote, maybe one of you know who it is. There's a quote by somebody who says that providence, I think they use the word providence is best seen or most clearly seen looking back in the past. And if you think about it, that may be the only way it's seen. I mean, it's really hard in the moment to definitively say, well, this is God doing this or that. But it's really easy when you get later in life and you look back and say, oh, okay, I see where you were acting there. I see what happened here. I remember this low point that I thought was the end of me actually was the beginning of something new. I see that, this that I wish had worked out this way that didn't work out that way actually worked out for the best. And so discernment is what we do in the moment, but 2020 vision is really what we look back after we get later in life and can actually see. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't remember who said it, but there was a succinct way that there's a quote out there where somebody says that. And I think that's powerfully applicable to this situation here. So we have like 4 extra minutes. If you don't have any questions or anything, I can read the prayer and we can go to lunch early, if that sounds good to you guys. I'm getting some smiles. I don't know what that means. That means, yeah, good, we don't have to listen to you talk anymore. All right, well, then I'm going to read through this prayer, which goes over 2 screens for this week, and we'll close with this. God, how we bless and thank you for the encouragement we have received and the lessons we can learn from reading and studying the book of Ruth. Thank you that we have become part of your ever-increasing family through faith in Christ, and we pray that we may grow in grace through all ever-increasing knowledge of Jesus. Thank you that no one is exempt from your plan of redemption and that there are no coincidences in our lives. We pray that you will use us to make a difference in our corner of the world. Thank you for not leaving us as widows or orphans, but raising us in heavenly places with Christ, our heavenly bridegroom, who loved us so much that he died in our place. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. And I would say that phrase right there in the prayer, we'll end with this. When it says, for not leaving us as widows or orphans, but raising us to heavenly places. Think of the status that Jesus has, that Paul says we're already raised to that same level with him. And if you think of that status as what a Na'ar is, what a prince is, what a person of that ranking is, then it makes a lot of sense that all of us with all of our different situations, some in here widowers, some in here widows, maybe some in here orphans, we're not left there. We're raised to the same level that Jesus is at now. And this is a story, just like Jesus is, where he emptied himself, of another biblical character who did the same thing, realizing that at the end, the only thing that matters is that we're with Yahweh, and for us, the only thing that matters is that we're in Christ. So go out rejoicing and be glad that that is our status, that we are Christians, little Christs, and I pray that everything you put your hand to and everything that you do, you represent him well in doing it. See you next week.